All right, let's dive straight into this explainer. Today we're taking an incredibly objective look at one of the most heavily reported missing person cases in modern history. Our goal here is to really unpack the evidence behind the McCann suspicions. We're going to unravel this massive 19-year web of forensic clues and legal battles surrounding the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. We want to figure out exactly how, and more importantly why, suspicions shifted so dramatically over the years, basing this purely on the actual case files and documented evidence.
So, 19 years later, what is the actual evidence? To answer that, we'll quickly run through the night it happened, the initial suspicion on the parents, the flawed forensics, the sudden emergence of a new prime suspect, the case against him, and finally, the big questions that are still unresolved today.
Section 1. The night it happened.
Okay, so we really have to start with the baseline facts of May 3, 2007. The different accounts from that evening created a super fractured timeline and a ridiculously narrow window of opportunity. So Gary checked at 9:05 p.m., right? He noted the door was slightly ajar. Then at 9:30, Matthew Oldfield checked, but didn't explicitly see Madeleine. By 10 p.m., Kate discovers her daughter is gone. These completely conflicting details about how doors and windows were left versus how they were ultimately found created some immediate, massive hurdles for the investigation.
Moving on to Section 2. Suspecting the parents.
By September of 2007, the Portuguese police formally declared Kate and Jerry McCann arguidos, which basically means official suspects. They built this initial case by leaning heavily on 2 British sniffer dogs. These dogs alerted to scents in apartment 5A, and incredibly, they also alerted to a Renault Scenic that the family hadn't even rented until 25 days after the disappearance. Crazy, right? Well, following those dog alerts, leaked claims of supposedly conclusive DNA matches basically pressured the police into making the parents official suspects.
Which brings us to Part 3, Forensics and Flawed Evidence. Now here is where you see a massive gap between the media sensation at the time and the actual forensic science. On one hand, the Portuguese police were operating under the strict belief that they had a 100% DNA match from the car boot. But on the other hand, the UK Forensic Science Service warned them that the specific test they used was just way too complex to interpret meaningfully. Because there were 3 to 5 different DNA contributors in that sample, they warned it could have entirely been a chance match or even just cross-contamination from her siblings.
When you actually lay out these early case flaws, the whole foundation of that initial suspicion really begins to crack. There were literally no intruder fingerprints found in the apartment at all. The canine terrain searches inexplicably only covered about 50% of the nearby area. Plus, legally speaking, dog alerts are completely inadmissible without corroborating physical evidence, which they just didn't have. And let's not forget the glaring logistical implausibility of the parents somehow moving a body in a car they didn't even rent until almost a month later. Honestly, these major missteps are exactly why the Portuguese Attorney General archived the case in July 2008 for a total lack of evidence.
Section 4. A new prime suspect.
Let's fast forward all the way to 2020. German authorities identify a totally different type of suspect, Christian Bruckner. This guy was a prolific burglar with over 17 convictions on his record, covering theft and some deeply serious sexual offenses, including crimes against children. He absolutely fit the profile of a dangerous, local serial offender who intimately knew his way around those Algarve tourist properties.
Section 5. The case against Bruckner. So a criminal record is one thing, but what's the actual proof tying him to this specific crime? Well, first, Bruckner lived less than 2 kilometers from the Ocean Club Resort. Second, verified phone data physically placed his mobile nearby shortly before she disappeared. Third, he abruptly packed up and left Portugal right after the event. And finally, when police raided his properties, they uncovered incredibly disturbing digital material, some of it literally buried underneath the grave of his deceased dog.
On top of that, the lead German prosecutor Hans Christian Wolters publicly stated that investigators found new, non-forensic evidence in a caravan used by Bruckner. These were allegedly items belonging to Madeleine. Now, the exact details of what those items are, they remain very closely guarded by the authorities to this day.
But this entire circumstantial web led Wolters to make a stunningly bold statement on global television back in 2022. He said, and I quote, "We are sure that he is the murderer of Madeleine McCann. We are sure that he killed Madeleine McCann." But here is the crazy part. The crucial number to remember here is 0. Because despite that overwhelming confidence from the prosecutors, exactly 0 formal charges have been filed against Bruckner in the McCann case. It really highlights this recurring theme we keep seeing, a massive disconnect between public statements of absolute certainty and the actual threshold of evidence you need to hold up in a court of law.
Section 6. Lingering unresolved questions.
So almost 2 decades later, this whole thing remains a vastly complex web of unresolved leads. If you do a deep dive into the original police files, you find numerous witness sightings that were just dropped. For instance, you had conflicting suspect descriptions from witnesses Jane Tanner and Martin Smith, and get this, they were never even cross-checked. A promising 2008 sighting in Vila Moura? Completely abandoned. Reports of unidentified men loitering and specifically asking about blonde children? Dismissed. It seems the initial tunnel vision on the parents created these massive blind spots early on.
And we have to ask some fundamental questions about the physical investigation, too. Why were those physical searches limited to just 50% of the nearby terrain? Why were the local scrublands and sewers just left totally unprobed during those critical early days? These huge logistical gaps mean that vital physical evidence could have so easily been missed forever.
Looking at the present day, we really have to objectively question the German case as well. Keep in mind, Bruckner was actually fully acquitted in October 2024 in a trial for unrelated Portuguese offenses. The federal prosecutor general is fighting to overturn that verdict, even calling it chaotic. But if the evidence in that case failed to secure a conviction, you have to ask, is this unrevealed McCann evidence actually strong enough to stick? Or are prosecutors just banking on his past villainy to force a break in the case?
So we've walked through the fractured timeline, the terribly flawed forensics, and this deeply circumstantial web surrounding a new prime suspect. But in a case so completely defined by rushed interpretations and missing puzzle pieces, what do we actually have? 19 years later, are we genuinely closer to definitive certainty? Or are we all just staring at a different set of shadows? Let that sink